Thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here. My topic today is the problem of freedom of speech and a related phenomenon, which I'm going to call freedom of thought. I want to start with the question: is there a problem, is there a crisis of freedom of speech today? Now, so that there is no suspense, no vulgar suspense, I will tell you what my answer is. My answer is that if there is a crisis, it's not about freedom of speech as such. Concerns about freedom of speech can indicate something which is much more serious. Freedom of speech matters, I want to say, because freedom of thought matters. Now, it's common today, and here I'm talking about discussions in the United States and in Britain and other areas, but I also believe that a lot of these things are going on in Germany and in Austria too. Both on the left and the right, there is a conception that freedom of speech is in crisis. On the right, we find that there's a reaction to what's become known as the woke ideology, or what used to be called political correctness, cancel culture, and broadly speaking, identity politics. But on the left, we also see, particularly in the United States, a response to the criticism of critical race theory and other phenomena. But by left-wingers, the response is that this interferes with academic freedom, it interferes with educational freedom and freedom of speech. So both sides in what is known as the culture wars appeal to the value of freedom of speech. But what is the value of freedom of speech? Why does it matter? Why is it valuable at all? Why should it matter whether we can say what we like? Now, I think if you're in the American context, there's a quick answer to this. And the quick answer is that freedom of speech is a right. It's a human right, protected by the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States has this as its First Amendment, written in 1791, that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, of course, this doesn't help those of us who don't live in a country with this as a constitutional right. It doesn't answer the question for us. It doesn't help those of us who don't even have a constitution. But in America, it's very common for appeals to freedom of speech to be made as a response to certain problems, which on the face of it don't have much to do with freedom of speech. So very quickly in American debates, we will appeal to First Amendment rights when talking about other things. For example, here's a rather extraordinary example, that in the 1980s, the legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin defended the right of pornographers to produce pornography on the grounds that this was in accord with First Amendment rights. But this is really rather strange. Why is it a debate about freedom of speech as opposed to being the debate about the freedom to produce pornographic material, whether there should be such a freedom? What's it got to do with speech? So I mention this to draw attention to the fact that in the United States it's very common to appeal immediately to a right of freedom of speech without explaining why it matters. In fact, if you think about it, there must be limits to freedom of speech. No one should believe that any speech at all should be permitted at any time, in any place, by any person. I should not have the right to stand in the centre of Salzburg and broadcast obscenities 24 hours a day at a very loud volume. No one should have that right. So freedom of speech cannot be an inviolable right, and it should not be. And this is because other values can override this right. We have a conflict of values, conflict of rights, and other values can override it. Having said this, this doesn't yet answer the question of why free speech is a value at all. Why should it matter? Why should it be so important? I think the strongest answer to this question is the liberal answer. And that is that freedom of speech is a value because freedom is a fundamental value. And by a fundamental value, I mean it's a value whose importance and significance to us cannot be explained in other terms. And I think this is implicit in the comments that Dr. Flick made at the beginning in her opening remarks. Liberals say that the state should interfere with individual freedom as little as possible. If John Stuart Mill is right in his famous essay on liberty, they should only interfere when it is to prevent harm to others. This is a famous principle of Mill's liberalism. So the simple answer then is that the value of freedom of speech derives from the value of freedom as such. I'm not saying that the explanation of the value of freedom is a simple thing, but freedom of speech matters because freedom matters. And that will explain why freedom of speech should sometimes be limited. So what are debates about freedom of speech really about? I want to say that often they're not really about freedom of speech, they're about other things. And if we put it in terms of the harm principle of John Stuart Mill, then we should see that these debates are really about whether harm is likely to be caused by the expression of some ideas. That's what the concern about limiting freedom of speech really is. So this, I think, should be the question for liberals, not the question about whether we have an abstract right to freedom of speech, which anyone who's been involved in these discussions knows that those discussions go round in circles very, very quickly. So what we need to look at is the question of harm and how much harm is actually caused by people speaking in certain ways. Of course, I'm not saying that's a simple question either, but it's a very specific question about the specific situations. And one thing I would say is that it cannot be that harm is caused to someone by speech just because they think they've been harmed. However, in the next part of my talk, I want to raise what I think is another deeper point about freedom, which is not just this familiar point about the restriction of speech based on harm. One danger, I think, in restricting freedom of speech is that it can restrict freedom of thought. And this is because what people are capable of thinking is conditioned by the range of concepts that they have and the words they use. I don't say that people are incapable of thinking without words. I don't think all thinking occurs in words. I think there's lots of thinking that doesn't occur in words. But our ability to use words is what gives our thought the depth and richness that it has. And I think that when our use of certain words can be restricted, then this can also restrict the things that we can think. So where language is forbidden, this can erode the capacity to think, I want to say. So I'll give a contemporary example. The word cisgender is used in debates about gender and sexuality these days to mean something like those people who identify with the gender conventionally associated with their biological sex. So if you identify with the conventional associations of being a woman or being a man, then you are a cisgender person. Now, those people who like to talk in this way say that anyone who isn't transgender, that is, anyone who doesn't identify with the conventional associations of associated with their sex, their biological sex, they want to say anyone who isn't transgender is actually cisgender. Many people want to object to that by saying that they don't identify with any conventional marks of gender and sexuality at all. And they want to resist that whole idea of identifying as belonging to a certain gender. But if we are obliged to talk in terms of cisgender, then that idea can't be expressed. Because the only way to express that idea is to deny that you are associating with the conventional gender roles attached to your biological sex. And on this way of thinking, that makes you transgender. So if you don't want to identify with any gender, if you don't want to say, I don't identify with these traditional gender roles, that's not the way I think of it. I just think I am a biological being, I am male or I'm female. If you don't want to identify in that way, then you can't express that thought given this terminology. Perhaps I could make the point with an analogy with the concept of cultural appropriation. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this idea. This is supposed to be something bad, cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is the idea, is taking an element from one culture and incorporating it into an aspect of one's own culture, as it may be artistic or conceptual or visual or other things, clothing and so on. Now, in the culture wars, this is one of the things that is thought to be a mistake or a fault or something that needs to be penalized or eliminated. And that's because cultural appropriation can be done in ways that are degrading or insulting to people. So people dressing up in blackface, as they call it in America, that can be insulting or degrading to people. But it seems to me that what's wrong with this is because it's degrading or insulting, not because it's cultural appropriation. The mere idea that you can take things from other cultures and incorporate them into your own culture is actually the source of creativity in culture. And to exaggerate perhaps a little, without cultural appropriation, art or cuisine, this is a very good example. I mean, food would, as we know it, would be impossible without cultural appropriation. Art could not exist without cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation cannot be a bad thing. Now, my analogy here is that those who think cultural appropriation is a bad thing are trying to force people to think in a certain way. And in doing so, they've closed off opportunities for creative thinking. They've also closed off opportunities for bad thinking too. But both of those things come together. So that's an analogy to make the point about how freedom of thought might depend on freedom of speech. George Orwell's term "thoughtcrime" is a good word for this phenomenon. It's one thing to restrict what people can say in public. That's one issue. It's a very different thing to regulate what they should think. Orwell drew attention to that idea, how totalitarian states attempt to regulate how people think. Forcing people to talk in certain ways, however, also can force them to think in certain ways. This takes time, it doesn't happen immediately, but it can happen. And this, I think, is deeply illiberal. So if we want to hold on to liberal principles at all, we must resist this idea that you can compel people to think in certain ways. In the heart of liberalism, I want to say, is the concept of tolerance. Tolerance is something that's often misunderstood, I've found. Sometimes tolerance is described as the view that all views are equally valid, or that everyone's views deserve respect. And of course, if that's what tolerance means, then tolerance is a bad thing, because not all views deserve respect. Not all views are equally valid. Tolerance, in fact, what tolerance really means is it's the acceptance of something that you object to. It's of the essence of tolerance that you object to something. I tolerate my neighbour's loud music because I want to live in peace with them. I don't tolerate the abolition of torture, which is one of my principles. I think this is not something I tolerate. This is something that I believe in. Now, the interesting thing about toleration is that I'm here to generalize wildly, if I'm allowed to, in my last few minutes. The origin of religious toleration and the origin of liberalism arose together at the same time. Religious tolerance, I think, emerged, or it's a commonplace to say that religious tolerance emerged in Western Europe because the state realized it could not force belief upon people. And this is expressed in the actual definition of tolerance from the tolerance, from the dictionary of the first dictionary of the Académie Française. Like tolerance is defined as sufferance, forbearance that one has for what one cannot prevent. So it's what one cannot prevent, those are the things you tolerate. But within 100 years, this failure, the failure to prevent these things, the failure to compel people to believe the same things, was turned into a success. And the success was the creation of religious liberty, the right to religious freedom. So this is what you have in the Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. No one should be disturbed for his opinions, even in religion, provided that their manifestation does not trouble public order as established by law. So tolerance as forbearance, putting up with something that you can't change, has become a right of human beings. And here, the important distinction is the one I've marked in red, which is the distinction between opinions and their manifestations, the speech and writing. Then if we go back to the First Amendment, we can see that right at the very beginning of the First Amendment, the thing that's mentioned is religious freedom. So around the same time, this was regarded as a fundamental right. This is one of the Bill of Rights. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's what the First Amendment says straight away. It's about freedom of belief, freedom of thought. And I think this is an important point that's often overlooked in discussions of this First Amendment and the freedom of speech. So I think we can learn from the history of religious tolerance, or toleration. And what I'd like to conclude by saying this, that a liberal state can legitimately prohibit certain forms of speech if they genuinely cause harm. And I'm not saying that's a simple matter to decide what causes harm and what doesn't. But that should be the question. But the state cannot and should not compel belief. And this will have unhappy consequences, because people will believe horrible things, and people will believe bad things and vile things and violent things. But the state cannot compel belief. We tolerate those opinions that we object to, but these opinions might not deserve respect. It's a very important fact. By saying that we tolerate these opinions does not mean that we think these opinions are worthy of respect. In a sense, we respect the people who hold the opinions, but we don't have to respect the opinions. Now, it might be disappointing, I want to say, that we cannot control the beliefs of others, and particularly as an educator. I've spent 30 years or more trying to tell people what to believe. Generally, it doesn't work. But that's philosophy for you. I think it might be disappointing. We might be disappointed that we can't control the beliefs of others, but I think it's fundamental consequence of genuine freedom. Thank you very much for your listening.